Welcome everybody. This is Orphans Are Everywhere, an epidemic that has overtaken popular entertainment. That little subcategory has taken many forms over the years. My name is Matt Swift. I'm the program coordinator at Ohio State University with the Film Studies Program, where I teach film production as well as film scholarship, film theory, things like that. And this is a kind of a pet project of mine that I've been working on for a long time. One night a long time ago, we were just kind of sitting around, me and my partner here, Nikki, who's running the camera, and we were talking about anime and other films, and I realized that when I explained to people about Naruto from Japan, I kind of defined it by saying, I know you've seen Harry Potter, but this is like Harry Potter but with ninjas, and the monster's on the inside, not the outside. And I was like, yeah, they're both orphans too, so that makes sense. And then we just started talking about how many orphans we knew in film and television and how this character is really prolific. And then, you know, recently with all the surgence of comic book films and Marvel and DC, there's a lot of talk about their reliance on the origin story. And a lot of people are like, okay, are we gonna get past that at some point? Are we gonna be able to like show Spider-Man without showing Uncle Ben dying in his arms? Like, are we gonna be able to just focus on the character and not this traumatic loss that's created most of them? And it doesn't seem like that's changing anytime soon. Because like I just dialed into even Star Wars last night. I turned on Rogue One, right? The first 5 minutes of that film is, hey, let's show a little kid losing both of her parents. And that's the drive for the whole rest of the movie, is her finding her dad at the Death Star or whatever. That's gonna be the base of the topic. I brought in a few people here today. I'll let them introduce themselves. And then we'll just get started with some questions. And hopefully we'll be able to engage some of you in the audience as well. With some questions and some stuff. So, thanks.
Hello, my name is Dr. Kay Clopton, newly minted doctor from the Department of Comparative Studies at The Ohio State University. I'm also a librarian resident at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. I will be there for the next 2 years, working in cultural diversity. My dissertation was actually on sound effects in Japanese manga and North American comics and how they impact the reading experience.
And I'm Christopher Jeansonne. I'm currently a doctoral candidate, which means I'm still just 300-400 pages away from my becoming a doctor. In the Arts Administration, Education, and Policy Department, though I also teach for the film program at OSU. And so I've gotten to teach for both my own home department and film studies, a lot of popular culture classes, including a class on superheroes, which is actually the focus of my dissertation. So using superheroes in the classroom and having students be the ones who drive the way that the educational experience works. So the idea was to make students into heroes of their own learning, right, is the idea. So I get to do a lot of research and scholarly stuff with really fun things like superheroes.
My name is Michael Watson. I am over my own publishing house called Freestyle Komicss, and I just make pretty pictures and tell a story. I've been doing that for a while now. I've been doing it since 2004 professionally, and I have 5 books that I self-published. Later on this year, we'll be releasing 2 more, and yeah, that's about it. I just make comic books. I'm pretty low to the ground. I mean, I wish I had a doc.
And Michael has a booth down in aisle 400, down in the exhibition space. And this is actually one of the characters from Freestyle here, Vigilance.
Yes.
We got a cosplayer here in the crowd too, so you can check that out later. Real quick, I just want to do a show of hands, because this is going to be a big part of the conversation here, I think. How many people in a room actually know someone in the real world that is an orphan? Awesome. So we got 2 people, 3 people. Actually, everybody here on this table knows somebody is an orphan. They just may not know it yet. So not a lot of people know someone who's an orphan because they only make up about 2% of the population between the ages of 0 and 18. The way this research came about to try to talk about this topic and understand the proliferation of this character is that I watched the top 20 box office films from 2001 to 2010. And my cool party trick is, like, you know, I watched 200 films from the previous decade. How many of those films do you think have an orphan character in them? You got a guess?
190.
Okay, that's high. That's usually the highest I get. The camera person is not allowed to answer because she knows the answer. So, just a wild guess number. Out of 200 films, most popular films, how many? 83. 183? Let's subtract the 100. So 87, right? So 43% of our most popular films, the character is an orphan. We're talking about like Harry Potter, half of the X-Men universe, Will Turner from Pirates of the Caribbean, like you name it. There's tons of this. And almost all the films, they start out with a traumatic loss where they show the character losing their parent, and that's the main drive of the film. It's this like origin story that we tap into. If you look at just the top 10 box office films from that decade, 7 out of 10 of our most popular films from the past decade had an orphan character in them, right? That's a huge, like there's only 2% of our population, yet almost half of our media uses this character as some kind of sympathetic engagement. And that's the kind of thing I want to talk about today. We have some different perspectives here going on. I just learned something cool from Michael, so maybe we'll start with him. Vigilance actually has an origin story a little bit. Why don't you tell us about Vigilance a little bit?
Well, after being asked to be on the panel, I was over his house a few months ago, and he brought this whole thing up to me. And it really didn't occur to me till like yesterday when I knew I had to be on the panel, that Vigilance is actually an orphan character, and I didn't realize it. She is from another planet, and she is actually the destroyer of her world, where she destroyed her entire race. And she lands on our planet with amnesia. So she has no idea that she's done this, but it's about to be unveiled to her in a very rude way, as there are some survivors, but so her parents are gone. They're dead. She's on her own. But I wanted to ask you a question about so what are you defining as the true definition as being an orphan? Because Hotshot does not have a father, but he has a mother. So does that qualify him for it, or partial, or are you talking about no parents at all?
Well, and to add to that too, a character like Iron Man, we consider him really an orphan when his parents basically died, but when he was an adult, when he was a young adult. So, yeah.
Well, so that's a tough question to answer. When I do this and I'm looking at these films and the numbers I'm giving you, it's based on films that are showing a character whose parents are gone.
Okay. So
and it's showing the loss of those parents completely. In most Western civilized worlds, civilizations where we've had a strong kind of movement with women's rights and things like that, both parents would be considered an orphan. In some countries, just the father alone may still classify them in their own culture, but for the purposes of this, it's like loss of both parents, and it's lost before the age of 18.
Okay.
Right? You're going to have some of the same experiences around 20, 21 as a real world orphan, but before the age of 18, you become property of the government, basically. You're property of the society, and you have no rights of your own. You have to rely on them for all of your basic needs, right? And that changes the dynamic of who you are as a person, and it would change the dynamic of most of these characters, right? And Iron Man's sticky because it's like it depends on what story you're looking at. There was an animation put out where he was a teenager, and his parents were dead. Right, which is different from maybe what has been done in some of the films, right?
College.
So that really does change it a little bit. So that's interesting. So we just learned so when you were developing the character, how did you come up with the story about this loss and what needed to happen?
That's super complicated because when I first created Jeansonne, I created it out of a need of I felt like they don't put enough focus on female characters, or when they do, they don't put in the same amount of work as they would as a male character or whatnot. So I wanted to have a character that was independent and powerful and is a female that would stand out. So I knew that's what I wanted to do off rip. And then she ended up getting really popular because she made her first appearance in the Hotshot series. And she got really popular in there, and people were asking so many questions about her. And I wanted to she's basically our Superman. She's the strongest character in our world. I wanted to have her be like this immovable object. She's very direct, she's very to the point, and when people think of heroism, they think of Vigilance. She is the embodiment of it. So we wanted to take this character that's at this pinnacle in her career as a superhero, and then we wanted to shatter it. We wanted to break her down and have to rebuild her up, not with, fighting some giant monster or something, but fighting like who she is, and really develop her as a person, as a female on our planet. Once she realizes that, this thing where I was this great superhero, is that the real me, or am I this monster that destroyed my world? So have her struggle with that and try to rebuild herself on our world.
Well, and maybe to kind of add to that question too, the parallels with Superman, because that's one thing about Superman. As the first superhero, he also sort of got to have his cake and eat it too, because he gets to be this orphan that we feel sympathetic towards, right? Because he lost his planet and everything. But then he also gets to have this, very supportive father and mother.
Yes.
And then he gets to lose the father again. Can you speak?
To play with a little bit, I love Superman. Superman's one of the first characters that got me into it. He's an icon. You can't like really be in the comics and not appreciate Superman in some respect. So where we take her, where she's at right now, she loses control for a moment because she doesn't realize what she is, and she's being manipulated, and she kills one of the villains that she's fighting, and everyone's looking like, whoa, Vigilance doesn't do that. Like she's forceful, but she can bring things in, and that's when the disconnect starts to come in with her. So in the newest issue of Vigilance, we start exploring her mental side in the new issue at the time where she committed this murder on scene, and we see she's struggling with the inside depths of herself, that this dark part of her is trying to break free, and she has no idea what it is. So when she comes to it, her image of who she is on this planet gets shattered and taken away from her. So it's a constant question of, am I this person or am I this other thing? Because was I the one making these choices? Like, is this who I am at my core? And I really wanted to explore picking those pieces up. And like, I'm a real big character guy, because I feel like you got to get involved with the character to actually want to see the superhero win, or at the most part, get involved with the character to see the superhero fail, whatever fits your fancy. But so she doesn't have any parents or anything like that. Hotshot her and Hotshot kind of have like a deal going on where Hotshot teaches her how to be a cooler human, and she teaches Hotshot to be a stronger superhero. So when she killed this character, the media came at her hard. All the reporters came in her face. Hotshot saw it, got in front of them, told him to kick rocks, and then they took off into the sky. And Hotshot's trying to talk to her, and she's still flying. But Hotshot gets in front of her, and he's like, no, like, you don't get to kill people. That's not how you solve your problems. You're the embodiment of why we do this. You're it. You're supposed to find a way to do this without murder. We're heroes. And for her to have Hotshot be this young rookie hero, tell her that, like, that's what like kind of gets to her even more. Like, I'm supposed to teach this guy what's going on. He comes to me up, and now he's checking me about taking a life. And that's when we get this first moment with her where she seems more human than she really is, and like it kind of shakes her to her core. She's like, it's not that I didn't want to do it, I almost enjoyed it when it happened, and it felt right. Like, it felt like the right thing to do. It felt like who I was. So her being called on it by a friend, a close friend in the superhero business, is kind of like around the sound lanes of Clark being sheltered by his dad and having his amazing parents, and then just suffering through that loss again.
And so a big question that comes into some of the other research, so we can bring in some other things, is so when you're going to show this mental aspect of her, that she's struggling, like what kind of imagery, sounds, like what kind of stuff are you putting in the panels to show this inner struggle? Do you have an idea of what that looks like?
So one of my favorite scenes is like when we go in her conscience. It's total darkness, and she's sitting in a liquid purple pool, and her body is just like barely floating in there, and then when she wakes up, she starts to drown in it. That's representation of the darkness swooping over. And one of my favorite homage scenes, I love it to death, I don't care what nobody say, we homaged Superman 75, where Doomsday is punching the wall, and you're like, well, who is this? You don't know what it is. So we mimic that, and we use that as her dark side punching through. So as we do these these moments where we go inside her conscious, the wall is breaking down more and more. The other characters' gloves are tearing up more and more. It's getting closer to breaking through. And it's these things are happening inside of her because of what's happening outside. She's having this fight with another character called Void. Void is a darkness. He's a dark entity. He knows it. He loves it. He salivates for darkness, and he wants to extinguish the light. But he sees the darkness in her, and he realizes she doesn't know what she is. If I can corrupt her and bring it out, we can destroy Hotshot. So as he is pushing her further and further, the fists are smashing more and more through the wall because he keeps antagonizing her. Almost like he's doping her up, giving her a drug. And so there's a moment in the Hotshot book where she gets lit, like full-on impact put in the pavement. And the next time we see her, her eyes are imbued with purple energy, and she just knocks Void's jaw off. And that's the moment where she's encompassed or enthralled in the darkness. So we thought it'd be really cool if issue 3 of Vigilance showed that entire fight from her perspective. So in Hotshot, it's all from Hotshot's perspective. Everything that we see is happening, like Hotshot's trying to calm her down. Hotshot's trying to stop Void from killing people in the city. And you see all that, but then you get to issue 3, if you put both of these books together, it's 2 sides of the same story.
Yeah.
So there's a scene where Vigilance is snapping and she's punching Void, hammering him into the concrete, which mimics the smashing of the wall.
Yeah.
And Hotshot grabs her arm and stops it. He's like, Vigilance, stop, calm down. So when we do that scene in Vigilance's book, she sees the ghost of Justice, who's the person who trained her.
Okay.
So like people now we're really going into her head and showing you like, wow, look, this is what she saw versus what Hotshot saw.
So that's what I wanted to try to get at, is what you're going to use this metaphorical imagery of her drowning, but eventually you do get to show some kind of, you personify a kind of a loss, a nostalgia, something that she's remembering, right? And that seems to be a common theme in a lot of these films, where they'll show a flashback, where they, like I said, you can't show any of those first sets of Spider-Man without them replaying that scene of Uncle Ben dying over and over again. They'll do it through a flashback sequence. They'll do it the same thing with Batman, with any of these superhero characters. And again, like I was just refreshing with Rogue One. They spend 5 minutes showing this thing, and then at the 10-minute mark, they actually replay it in her head as a dream. I'm like, you just showed this 5 minutes ago. Why are you showing it again? We already know, we saw this. We don't need to see it a second time. And so they use these flashbacks and try to connect you to a person to really get you emotionally involved. So I'd like to come to Kay here. You work with a lot of stuff coming over from Japan, and I started this discussion with like how Naruto and Harry Potter are similar. And I know if you go into even manga and anime, there's a ton of orphan characters there. It's done slightly different though. It's a lot more that metaphorical inside kind of dealing with your inner stuff as opposed to the outer loss. Like, do you have any examples of things where you've seen moving from the one looking at Japanese and American adaptations and how they handle that?
Well, I think one of the things that I find most interesting in anime manga in particular is that you will get series where you will have an orphan and it's just taken for granted that they're orphans. They don't do an origin story where you find out what happened to the parents. It's more or less you find out 5 to 20 episodes later that Tuxedo Kamen's parents were killed in a car accident. You have no idea that he's an orphan, and it's like, oh yeah, he's an orphan, we don't care about that. Same thing with Sailor Jupiter. Sailor Jupiter lives by herself. It takes about 4 or 5 volumes of the manga before you find out that she's an orphan and her parents died in a plane crash. And you don't even get those laid out for you. She's living in her apartment, she sees a plane on a television, freaks out. And then you're like, oh, that's what happened to her parents. So they don't forefront it. It's like, okay, so we have all these orphans in Japan who clearly have all this money because they all live by themselves, have these fabulous apartments, and they're rolling around. And keep in mind, Sailor Jupiter, when we meet her, is 8th grade. So we're not talking, someone who's old enough to actually work a job or be able to sustain themselves. This is some kid living in a really nice apartment in the middle of Tokyo. And so they do these stories where they're not really trying to focus on it. It's kind of like, okay, we'll explain it, but you'll have to really be paying attention. Whereas you get Batman, and in every movie of Batman, you will get his origin story. It's like, we have to establish that his parents died. Like, okay. So I have seen his origin story about 20 times, and it is a change. It's not like we're getting different versions of this death. It's more or less, it's the same outline over and over again, and it's like we're trying to establish the emotional impact, but we're also trying to connect you to that particular actor. So it seems like every time you have someone else playing Batman, you have to do the origin story so that you link up that story with that actor playing Batman, so that you have this together, so that you are anchored and on board, despite the fact that it's completely unnecessary and just eats up time when you could do so much more with these stories. It's just, oh, well, we have to set the tone. No, we don't. We know this one. If you were doing a new character, it'd be something else. But with established characters, no. But in Japan, it's just, they're there, and we are not going to bother to explain it. And usually, first episode, we aren't doing this at all. It's just, okay, there are people here. All right, where are their parents? We don't know. Do we care? Not really, because the parents aren't really important. Which gets into like a whole different level of absent parents and why parents are just not important to stories unless they are the person who pushes you to do awful, awful things in the name of, I'm trying to get you to do something great. No, you're not. You're just a terrible person, and you're just there to be the foil because you're an adult, and adults are bad.
I would like to add in that Batman's origin story is the most used origin story out of any other thing because it's been redone in so many forms of media. Like, it actually has the record for it. But I do digress a little bit. In Batman v Superman, they did give you a different version of the origin story that was to serve the purpose for that Batman. And that's the only time they've done it. And it's they showed that his dad and his mother actually fought back. They showed that his dad protected the mom and took the bullet even though he knew he was going to get shot. And they showed that Martha was super important to him with his dad dying, saying Martha, in protection of her. So that was supposed to give Batman the strength to be Batman, to fight for people no matter what against all odds, but also be that calling card that most people hate, I don't mind it, that pulls him back in that fight when he says Martha, as Clark and Batman's mother have the same name, which I did not know until I saw that movie, and I've been reading comic books for years, and I can't believe I did not know that. That's probably why it doesn't bother me. But that would be the only difference.
Well, and let me actually throw in another example that's a little different, or a bit of throws a wrench in some of that, because I do think there's a lot of potential for retelling the orphan story in a new way that does reflect story and reflects the new approach to the story, the way that Michael's talking about it. The Spider-Man, right? The recent Spider-Mans. If we look at the three filmic Spider-Mans and the way they've each approached it, if Spider-Man Homecoming, and we actually need to get back to Infinity War too, because I was thinking, when I was writing notes about this, you could just call it Orphan War.
Yeah.
Right? There's like so many,
Yes.
pretty much all of the major characters are orphans in that. And Justice League, pretty much every single major character is orphaned in some way, shape, or form.
In the new Star Wars too, right?
Exactly.
The last Star Wars, it's
Yeah.
let all the orphans saving the galaxy.
Yeah, but going back to that Spider-Man, so in Spider-Man Homecoming, if they've just dropped the need to address the origin story, because they just assume everybody knows Spider-Man's origin story, right? But really what bothered me was the Tobey Maguire, I really liked the approach they took to that origin story, because they really focused on this notion of his sort of guilt in relationship to it, and that it becomes a real revelation for him in terms of his relationship to his sense of power. And if there was anything, I was trying to think, why do we have these orphan stories? You know, is it this idea of the mystery of where you come from, right? That somehow gives you this liberty of unknowing so that you have to recreate yourself? And it's this idea of the loss of power, and you know, you could almost go, you can go, they're Freudian with it too, right? This notion that having lost the parent allows you that space to recreate yourself. And it's what bothered me the most about, what's his name? I want to block out his name, the Spider-Man that was in between that.
Andrew Garfield.
Andrew Garfield's version of Spider-Man, and how they handled Uncle Ben and his death. That angered me so much. I wanted to stand up and shout because he starts out in most Spider-Man stories, right? He starts out and he's a kind of, you know, an outcast, kind of nerdy dude that we can identify with. And Andrew Garfield, he's already like the cool kid at the beginning. He's on his skateboard. He's like got the girl before he gets the Spider-Man powers. All of that, and he ends up not really being responsible whatsoever for Uncle Ben's death. he witnesses it and it causes him to go out and decide to become a superhero, but he has no connection
Right.
to the characters that Uncle Ben's death. And so all of that, you know, it makes me think about how yes, often the origin stories or the orphan stories, they're not really recreated, but then there are a lot of potentials for retelling it in a new way that speaks to the contemporary culture differently than we did.
I think I'm going to trouble that a little bit because I think with Spider-Man in particular, you don't have the long pop culture history for the average moviegoer because they didn't start making his movies until the early 2000s. So I think the potential is actually greater when you aren't overexposed. I think the problem with Batman versus Superman with the retelling is that I completely missed that part about the whole his father did sacrificing, so that when the whole thing, the significance about Martha is like, yeah, I don't care. So you know, you could, if you're going to be creative with something, you have to be able to do it in a way that a person will remember what the hell you said. It was like reliving a moment in another movie where I forgot what somebody said 2 minutes in, and at the end it's like, oh, I was supposed to remember this 2 hours later. I did not remember, forget it. But with Batman in particular, I think if we didn't have that origin story every single time, the impact of when you do changes would be far more important. It would actually just have that ability to grow and be able to be much more stand out and just be able to do something where it's like we're doing something different and not we've done this again and again and again and again and again, so that when we do something different, a lot of us will just completely miss it, which is unfortunate because that was actually a great moment in a movie that could have used more great moments. But
well, and this is actually a good example of Spider-Man Homecoming, I think, bringing it back to that. I don't think I'm spoiling too much for anybody, speaking in these general terms about it, but in that one, they skip the origin story, but instead the relationship with Iron Man is what becomes the sort of parental, you know, tension. So that's an interesting way of dealing with it without dealing with it again.
And so then we go to the new Spider-Man that's coming out, the animated, with Miles.
Yeah, that's
right. That has a Peter Parker.
I want to get one backtrack though.
Right.
Because like me and this guy think alike so much, and I love it. Because like everything he said about Andrew Garfield and those Spider-Man was like spot on. The one thing I think they did super well in Homecoming is they did address the Uncle Ben thing, but they addressed it as a teenager would address it. He doesn't know Tony Stark, he's just a fan of Tony Stark. Any adult that's going to ask me about that or ask me why I'm doing this, he kind of swallowed, paused, and you could see the emotion like there, but he glossed over it. It's like, and just spit out an excuse. Didn't go into any detail because who just openly talks about the death of their uncle that made them become a superhero? So in a way, they did address it and skipped over it at the same time, which I'm perfectly fine with. I think they handled that well. And I agree, I love severely that Iron Man has come in and become that role for him, because it just adds so much to Infinity War. Oh my God. Infinity War is amazing. I will argue anybody to the death about that movie, whatever. But that significance is there. And Tobey Maguire is my first Spider-Man. He did the first two movies, did it for me. And I didn't even kind of like channel all together, but they really did handle the Uncle Ben with the great power and great responsibility very well. And they did gloss over it in the new Spider-Man. They absolutely did, because that is the driving force of it. Then you get this new movie, which I don't know how many of you guys read comic books, but Miles Morales is from the alternate universe, which was a universe made because the movies were coming out. For people that go see the movies and they're like, oh shoot, I want to get comic books, so they would direct them to these books as, you know, great starters. Peter Parker he's a teenager in high school, 15 years old. The best book in the alternate universe, 125 issues. They kill him. What you don't find out is that this new kid, Miles Morales, gets bit by a spider too, a whole different one, and he becomes Spider-Man. And you think it's a complete cash grab, we're just switching him up to make him a black Latino kid so we can reach that audience. Then you actually read the death of Spider-Man. And not only is Peter Parker's death one of the most emotionally riveting story arcs that I've ever read, he in turn becomes Miles Morales' Uncle Ben. Because you see, oh my God, I'm gonna get emotional. Because you see Peter Parker fighting the Green Goblin in his last fight in front of his house mask off. Everyone knows it's him. And I mean, this is fire, brimstone, everything. Peter Parker, this 15-year-old kid in front of his aunt and his girlfriend fighting for their lives. You're just watching this thing happen, and he fights to the very last breath. He stops Norman Osborn, but he dies. Then you get Miles Morales #1, and you come to find out he was in the freaking crowd. He was watching the whole time, and he was going through his head. He was like, I should help, and he doesn't. Spider-Man freaking dies because Miles Morales didn't help. He had powers. That is his Uncle Ben. Are you kidding me? They took that origin story and flipped it completely on his head. He is totally in debt to Peter Parker now to be Spider-Man and do it. And when I read that story, man, I'm gonna let somebody else talk, man.
And so, I mean, that's really what takes me to the crux of why I'm interested in this topic. Is like, why is it that we have to focus so much on this traumatic drive, right? Why does it need to be there? The only thing I can really end up focusing on is that if you look at the history of our storytelling, especially in the industrialized world, all of these stories come out around times of alienation, right? A lot of these characters first came out right after the Depression. A lot of these comics and stuff like that. And you also had a lot of orphan stories coming out around that time with people like Mickey Rooney and Shirley Temple in movies. They played a lot of orphan characters in films, and then it just kind of trickled. It was there still, and then now it's come back because we have this shift in our economy and our politics, this alienation that's happening after 2011, after 9/11. Like suddenly we have this kind of alienation around the world. Yeah. And so what we can do is the orphan character embodies someone who basically, like, you can't think of another character that has so little. Who has less than an orphan, right? But yet they save the world.
Yeah.
Right. So what bigger dynamic can be created there about this idea of like Americans, they pick themselves up by their bootstraps, right? Does everybody in here know what a bootstrap is? It's that little thing on the back of your shoe that you can grab and hook yourself up, right? So, that's what that orphan character kind of represents. Now, if we go to Japan, though, it's something completely different.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the people that are creating these stories with orphans in them are orphans. And it's because of their history there, and the wars and the different stuff that's come out of there. And that's why theirs look a little different, because they're actual orphans telling orphan stories. And so they're doing what you talked about, right? A teenager isn't going to just openly talk about it.
Yeah.
Eventually it's going to come out, but you don't just open up with, hey, I'm an orphan. Right? That's not your thing, necessarily. And it's internalized differently, whereas like we're using it as this way to like identify with everybody, right? Teenagers, they feel anxiety about their parents, right? And it's not that some teenagers want their parents to not be there, but it gives them this like metaphor for like, okay, I don't need parents, I can grow up, I can do great things without them, right? It gives them this little sense of things they can do. And then for older people, like if you're struggling, if you have your own personal crises, or you go root for somebody who has nothing. And then at the end, they save the world, right? What better joyride is that? You walk out, it's like a drug almost. You're like, it's an IV of like sympathy, but then it's suddenly like, oh my gosh, happy pills, because I felt really bad. Now I feel really good. And you walk out into the rest of the world, and they just keep giving that to us over and over again. So I do want to take some time, like if anybody has any questions. We had a lot of people kind of wander in as we were still talking. Some of the people who have been here, like I'd actually like to open it up. If anybody has questions about a specific film, we're talking about orphans and film and TV. I do have a few more questions for the panelists I can bring up, but I do want to open it up to see if anybody has anything they want to ask.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, do you think because there are so many orphans as superheroes, it actually unlocks a power being able to not have your parents save you no longer, and now you are able to access a certain type of light in you to be able to take on the world? Like it just opens, like when you're going through an experience, you don't realize it until you've actually gone through it, you see a whole new perspective. Well, imagine, those superheroes, they don't have parents. So now they have to be strong on their own. It unlocks a power that we all may possess, but we don't have access to. Is that something you think this might, you know, have some type of weight to it?
Does anybody got something?
I think that relates to why we do have a lot of orphan stories. It takes a character that has nothing else to lose, that suffer a great loss, to be willing to put in the work and have the ability to save the world, to have that drive, because they don't have their parents, they don't have that experience, so it's like they're trying to save it for other people. I don't want you to go through what I went through. I don't want you to suffer through loss, because we have this idea of what the world is supposed to be and this pretty picture in our head how to make it. And so that orphan, that character, takes it upon their shoulder to try to create that and save it and keep it. Anybody that, and not to knock anybody that has their parents, but like you have your parents and hopefully they raised you right and you've had a great life, so you appreciate that and you take that for granted. So you don't know what it is to suffer. You don't know what it is to have that loss. But an orphan who's Bruce Wayne, who watched his parents die, now he knows the real grit and teeth of villainy. He knows what a criminal is. Spider-Man not being able to save his uncle because he didn't want to stop the crook that randomly ran out the store, gets to suffer great loss at watching his uncle die. He knows what that's like. He doesn't want anybody else to feel that. He doesn't want anybody else to suffer loss. Or any other character that's been faced with this, like what was it? I can't remember.
So I was thinking about again, going back to, like, you look at Infinity War, and if it could be Orphan War, right? You look at each one of them and how they deal with sort of the loss of power or someone who's in power above them. And I, like, on my notes on Thor, if you look at the film incarnations of Thor over the last few films, he doesn't really become responsible and sort of mature until he's set in exile, right, by the father. He becomes more powerful when his father falls asleep, right? Yeah. And then he sort of becomes most powerful in the more recent films, in Ragnarok, when he loses his father. And there's the twin story with, you know, essentially Loki and the siblings, and Loki's relationship with the father. He is actually an orphan but doesn't know it, doesn't find out about his own origin until much later. And we end up finding, again, this sort of family connection. The larger family connection becomes really important too in the beginning and opening of Infinity War. You see how important.
Yeah, I mean, Ragnarok sets that up big time with it. It's almost like a Yoda Odin, right? It's like, oh, I'm gonna, like, under stress, suddenly Yoda comes through the force into my mind or something, and it's like, guess what? You actually have more power than I do, and then, like, he embodies that. And I was like, how are they gonna keep? If they killed him off at the beginning, how are they gonna bring him back? And that's how they do it.
Yeah. So the shorter answer is yes. I do think that there's a lot of that sort of idea of losing those who have authority over you allows you to assume your own authority, especially in narrative.
I think you also see that in Japan as well, but it goes a slightly different route in that it's really about building a family, because what you have is a lot of group building, especially with a lot of anime where it seems to be this lone wolf character who ends up creating his family with all the people he ends up working with. Yu Hakusho is a really good example of that. And this was somebody who didn't get along with anybody, and then it's like, by the end he has like a super team, so he has a Sentai. And so you have a lot of it being about suffering loss, finding your power, and then suffering loss again. Sailor Moon is a really, really good one for this one. You have people who are orphans, they get to become a family, and then in the first season of the series, everyone dies. And it's just like, you finally have a family, you finally have a place to belong, and then you're losing it again. And it's just that crisis of, I finally had a place, I finally had somebody to fight for, and you sacrifice for that person because you finally have something that's like, I keep losing, and then we lose again, and then we bring everybody back and say, let's do it again.
There's a great example of this that's outside of the superhero universe. So in this research, this 200 films that I watched to come up with this idea, Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory with Johnny Depp, right? This whole thing is like, his dad abandons him because he wants to be a candy maker, right? Because his dad's a dentist, like really crazy dentist you would never want to go to. But then at the end, the very last line of that movie is, and Willie finally has a family. right? And that's every film. It always ends. I have these like 4 categories for how every orphan film happens. Like they fit this mold perfectly. In all of them, there's some kind of reclamation of family. So even though it's about achieving your own, there's always this wanting to still try to make a connection with other, whether that's some kind of romantic partner or building a family yourself, or suddenly like something like Ratatouille, which is a great cosplayer walking around the exhibit today for Ratatouille. Like he thinks his family's gone, he becomes a chef, and then at the end, oh wait, they didn't all get washed down a drain and die. They end up showing up in my restaurant. Woo, yay! Like right, that's the end of every one of these movies.
See, I think to touch on his Infinity War one, I think one of my favorite orphans is Peter Quill. And I've had to stand up for him since this movie came out because people just don't understand. Peter's a kid and he watched his mother die of cancer, has no idea who his father is. Then he gets sucked up into space by aliens and he's living this ragged life as a space pirate. Then he finds his dad. His dad is the egomaniac who ends up killing his mom and wanting to kill Peter. And that is my favorite scene in the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. When that man admits that he killed his father and Peter Quill snaps back and just starts bucking shots, that's real. That is real emotion in that scene right there. And then we finally get to where he finally gets Gamora. And what people fail to realize, if it's in the movie, if the directors and the writers are telling you, this is the situation, it doesn't matter whether you feel like it's justified or not, this is the situation. Peter is with Gamora, they are in love. That is it, that's the relationship. So Peter loses his mom, he loses his dad. He has not opened up and been a part of anyone his entire time in space. And he finally finds somebody in Gamora after chasing her down for however many years. They're in a relationship, he's finally happy. She asked him to kill her to keep her away from Thanos. And he fails. That's loss. That's hurt. That is emotion. I challenge anyone to try to hold their ground and follow a plan when you realize that you are now responsible for the death of the woman you love. That hurts. And I see it, like everything that you're saying, like all this pain, all this suffering, all this loss, that is the narrative that gets us involved in these characters. I mean, listen to me up here now. Peter is my boy till I die. I'm riding with him, I get it. That loss hurts. But again, he's been an orphan and he's suffered over and over and over again, and then he finds a family. He finds a family at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy. And they reinstitute that in part 2. Oh, I thought we were your family. Now you're happy that you got this dad who left you and was a nobody. And then he loses it. Oh my god, this is such a good panel, man.
Like haven't orphans had enough already? Come on. Like it's not enough they lost their parents and then like, okay, so then he finds a loved one and they drag him away. I mean, this happens over and over again. And then you get the really messed up ones like in the Star Wars universe where there's patricide and like, you know, oh, I don't know who my dad is. Oh, now I know who my dad is. Guess what? I'm gonna kill you. Like, what is up with this?
Well, I wanted to bring in one other one that I'm very curious how they're going to approach the continuation of the narrative in The Incredibles, right?
Oh, yeah.
I went back and rewatched The Incredibles, and as much as I liked it before, there are parts of it that really bother me. That's like, there's some really conservative stuff that's going on in that bothers me in terms of how they approach the idea of individuality and responsibility and the idea of the orphan character, right? So what they're saying essentially is that if you're not born super, you're not allowed to be super, right? That's essentially the message of that.
Yeah.
That you either have to be born that way or you have no way of becoming someone who is special, right? You're not special unless you're born special. In fact, the kid who is presented as an orphan to us and who works the hardest, wants to be the superhero the most, he becomes a villain. I'm curious how they're going to end up taking that, because really the message of that film bothers me a whole lot more when I'm watching it as a thinking adult than it did when I watched it.
Go ahead, one more.
Have you
Way back
considered how many villains are orphans?
So I could easily go and run the numbers and put them out there. You know, I'll probably post this online for people who would want to see the rest of this. We'll try to get it posted up. My name is Matt Swift. I'm easy to find on social media, OSU Film Studies. I'll probably post some stuff. I actually have, like, from that 2001 to 2010, I have all the orphan characters sitting here, right? 87 of them out of 200. Like, I could easily go through and find these out. It's a great deal of them. Just off the top of my head, there's a great deal of them that end up being villains in some way. We had one other question right here in the purple. Did you have something else you wanted to ask?
Oh, I was going to say, in the terms of The Incredibles, I always wondered whether or not Bucky was not listening when he told him not to. Part of the reason he might have been trying to protect Bucky, or what? Not Bucky, but Buddy. Sorry, wrong superhero. But it's like, as far as he's concerned, it's just a little kid who shows up and doesn't have any powers, so he doesn't like have any vulnerability. And he might, I mean, great for being a fan and all, but he might not want that, at that point, I don't think he wants that responsibility. And then you see it again with his own kids. He was like, when he saw his kids were on the plane that blew up, they were on the plane, but luckily they had powers, but he was being a kind of a responsible adult, but not wanting him to be there in the first place. And then all the supers were sued and they had to relocate, so he couldn't ever make anything right with them. So it wasn't really his fault.
He wasn't going to go make things right with that kid.
I know. He could show up again and his wife could say, hey, he's a kid, just lighten up on him.
You got one over here?
Yeah, go
Now
ahead.
it looks like the new one is that it's going to go the opposite way, where the mom's going to be out of the picture all the time.
Yeah.
You know? So, I mean, they're just going opposite extremes. It doesn't seem like they're really trying to stick with a good moral way to go.
Yep.
Well, the premise of the story is that they're trying to pick a super that's going to be the best candidate to help bring supers back in a legal format. And they think Elastigirl is their best choice. I don't know why they're making, like, what's their specific reason of it, but they're choosing her as that candidate. So she has to break the rules to get the world to see supers are needed. That's the premise that they're going along with.
Cool. Well, I want to thank everybody. We'll do one more real quick. We're kind of out of time, but go ahead. One more comment.
Would you consider Bucky Summers and Dawn and Orphans? I mean, the father was never really in the picture, but your character changes a lot once your mother dies. Is that more the fact that she was turned into an orphan raising her sister, or is that more the fact that she was just growing up?
Well, and by season 5, she becomes, like, when her mother does pass away, right? She becomes the head of the family at that point. I mean, I do think that the relationship and this idea of just having the loss of the father or the absence of the father, I think is very, very central to it. And I think her distance, I mean, she's a teenager at that point too. And so there's that dynamic of those who are in authority above you. She respects her mother, but she becomes very distant from her for a number of the seasons until she matures, and then she loses her mother, and then has to take sort of a different role and this sort of motherly role at that point. So I think I think we can look at it through this dynamic, but yeah, it's not as simple as she is an orphan.
Yeah, and for those who missed it, basically, like, I had done some research. I started this because I wanted to look. I looked at the top box office films from 2001 to 2010, 200 films, and 87 of those, it actually shows the loss of the parent while the person is under the age of 18, presumably, right? So even like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, a whole movie, like Angelina Jolie's character, I'm just like, oh my gosh, like she's just mean. She's mean. And then at the very end, they're in the car running from everybody, trying not to get spoilers, and they're comparing notes, her and Brad Pitt, about like their lives and the secrets they've been keeping from each other because they're spies against each other. She's like, yeah, remember our wedding? Those weren't my parents. They're dead. And then he's like, oh. And a light bulb goes on, and guess what? Then they're okay. Then they like start working together in the last 5 minutes of the film, right? And it's because you have to, it's this, a lot of this is, you can get some of the same lens just through loss. If you did just loss, I actually did take notes on that. It's like 94% of all of our films are about loss of family. Like 94% of them. Because we're all afraid of losing our families in one way, shape, or another, right? And so films are really good about tapping into that note for us. So I want to thank everybody for being able to come in, at least hear the last bit of this panel, as you're maybe waiting for another one or something. So, enjoy the movies. Last thing I like to just say real quick is one reason to start this is within the world of film studies, there's this thing called orphan films. And I get a little choked up on this section. Within our country, we've taken on the foster care system, and we kind of abandoned the term orphan. I'm just going to get too big to talk about this. And so a lot of organizations out there for orphans lack funding because of that. And the amount of money that we put into the film industry, you go out, you're watching, you're cheering for all of these orphans to succeed in these films. You know, if you care about this topic at all, look up a local organization. Try to support some kids.
Help some orphans.